Imani Jackson was 9 years old, with soft brown eyes, deep mahogany skin, and a crown of tightly coiled curls her mother styled into neat braids every Sunday evening. She lived in a quiet neighborhood of Montgomery, Alabama, with her mother Tasha, a nurse who always seemed to move through life with a quiet strength. Their apartment was small but full of warmth, walls decorated with framed photos, scented candles glowing in corners, and a shelf lined with children's books Tasha read aloud every night without fail. It was a Tuesday morning when Imani's third-grade teacher, Mrs. Holbrook, announced a class activity. The students, squirming in their desks, were asked to share what they wanted to be when they grew up. Excitement buzzed through the room. One by one, hands shot up: firefighter, doctor, YouTuber, dancer. When it was Imani's turn, she stood slowly, clutching her pencil like a lifeline, and with a sparkle in her eyes, said confidently, "I want to be a princess." For a brief moment, the room was silent. Then a voice in the back, sharp, careless, cut through the air like a blade. It was Lindsay, a girl with icy blue eyes and pale blonde hair tied in a pink ribbon. "You can't be a princess," she said with a scoff. "Princesses don't have dark skin or hair like yours." Some kids laughed, not out of cruelty, but confusion, like they weren't sure if it was a joke. Mrs. Holbrook clapped her hands, attempting to steer the conversation back to kindness and respect. But the damage had already been done. The moment passed. The class moved on, but Imani didn't. She sat back down, her heart sinking, the light in her eyes dimming. She didn't say another word for the rest of the day. Not during recess, not during lunch, not even when they played music during our class, which was usually her favorite part. When the final bell rang and she boarded the yellow school bus, Imani pressed her forehead to the cool window and watched the houses roll by in a blur. Her backpack felt heavier than usual, though it held only the same homework folder and snack wrapper as always. Tasha was waiting by the door when Imani arrived home. She greeted her daughter with a kiss on the forehead and a plate of warm mac and cheese. But Imani just sat at the table, pushing food around her plate with her fork. "How was school today, baby?" Tasha asked gently, her eyes searching her daughter's face for signs of joy or trouble. Imani shrugged. "It was fine. What did you do? Did you share your dream job like the teacher asked?" Imani hesitated for a moment, then looked down at her plate. "I changed my mind," she said. "I think I want to be an astronaut now." Tasha tilted her head slightly. "An astronaut? Huh? That's new." Imani nodded without looking up. "Yeah, princesses are kind of boring anyway." But the words were flat, lifeless, and the sadness in her eyes told another story, one she wasn't yet ready to say out loud. Later that evening, after Imani had gone to bed and the apartment had fallen into its nightly hush, Tasha sat alone on the couch, flipping through a parenting magazine she barely had energy to read. Something gnawed at her, a mother's instinct. A subtle change in her daughter's voice, the way her shoulders had curled inward, the way she hadn't reached for a bedtime book. She walked quietly into Imani's room. The girl was fast asleep, her arm curled around a stuffed bear with matted ears. On the desk beside her bed, Tasha noticed a sketchbook peeking out from under a stack of papers. Carefully, she pulled it out and began flipping through the pages. The drawings inside were meticulous. Dozens of princesses in gowns and castles, tiaras and magical animals. But something stopped her. Each princess had the same features: porcelain skin, long golden hair, blue eyes. On the corner of one page, written in shaky pencil, were the words, "They're the real ones. I'm not one of them." Tasha closed the sketchbook slowly. Her jaw tightened. She turned off the bedroom light and stepped back into the living room. There was a time for gentle encouragement. But this was not that time. This was the moment she would remind her daughter who she really was. Not just in words, in truth, in history, in pride. She poured herself a glass of water, sat back down, and began making a plan. By the time the weekend arrived, Tasha had already combed through dozens of articles, biographies, and photographs, following a path that took her deep into the legacies of African royalty and powerful women of color whose names had never made it into her daughter's school books. She'd spend hours at the local library, cross-referencing books with websites, watching documentaries in the early morning hours before her shifts. She was no historian, but she was a mother, and for Imani, she would become whatever she needed to be. That Saturday morning, sunlight filled the small apartment, casting long shadows on the floor as Imani sat cross-legged on the living room rug, drawing in silence. Tasha entered with a soft smile and a large photo album tucked under her arm. "Hey, baby," she said, settling beside her daughter. "Mind if I show you something?" Imani shrugged, eyes still on the paper where she was shading the hair of yet another fair-skinned princess. Tasha opened the album slowly, revealing images printed off the internet and carefully glued onto each page. Some were vibrant paintings, others grainy black and white photos, but every single one was chosen with intention. "Do you know who this is?" she asked, pointing to the first image, an oil painting of a fierce woman wearing a suit of armor, a spear in one hand and a shield in the other. Imani shook her head. "This is Queen Amina of Zazzau. She was a warrior queen in what is now Nigeria. She led armies, built cities. People feared her and followed her." She turned the page. "And this," she continued, showing a regal young woman in traditional dress, "is Princess Elizabeth Bagaya of Uganda. She studied in London, became a lawyer, and represented her country at the United Nations. She's still alive." Imani glanced up from her drawing, her interest caught but carefully guarded. Tasha kept going. Each page turn revealed a new face, a new story. Makeda, the Queen of Sheba, Kandake Amanirenas of Kush, Yanenga of the Mossy Kingdom. Names Imani had never heard in any class. Faces she had never seen in any of her books or cartoons. They were real. Imani asked finally, eyes lingering on a photo of Princess Elizabeth, her expression poised and confident. "Very real," Tasha said. "And every one of them had dark skin, hair like yours, walked like you, held their heads high like you. But they're not fairy tale princesses," Imani replied quietly. Tasha leaned in. "No, they're not. They didn't wait in towers. They didn't wear glass slippers. They ruled. They protected their people. They didn't need magic. They were the magic." Imani looked away, her fingers tightening around her colored pencil. Tasha could see the conflict in her daughter's face, the ache of wanting to believe, colliding with the weight of what she'd been told. Then Tasha reached under the couch and pulled out a small, wrapped package. "I got you something." Imani unwrapped it slowly, revealing a hardbound book with gold lettering. African royalty, queens, warriors, and leaders. She opened the cover, her breath catching at the first full-page illustration of a queen seated on a golden throne, head held high, robes flowing like rivers. Tasha placed a gentle hand on her daughter's back. "Imani, you don't have to change your dream to fit someone else's idea of who can wear a crown. You can be a princess. But even more than that, you already are one. You just don't know it yet." There was a long silence. Then, without looking up, Imani whispered, "What if they laugh again?" Tasha took a breath. Her voice softened, but it didn't waver. "Then let them laugh, while you walk past them like royalty." Later that evening, the apartment turned into something like a design studio. Fabric from Tasha's closet was spread across the floor, rich purples, deep reds, gold trim, beads, and cords. Imani, now standing in front of the mirror, held a strip of cloth across her chest, her reflection slowly transforming into something she had never allowed herself to imagine. Tasha knelt beside her, pinning fabric and adjusting folds. "We'll need a crown," she murmured, "but not plastic. Something real. Something fit for a queen." They spent hours working together, stitching and tying, laughing for the first time in days. Imani began to speak more, asking questions about the women in the book, trying on different postures, practicing a graceful curtsy in front of the bathroom mirror. At one point, she stopped, her face suddenly serious. "Do you think the other kids will know what I am?" Tasha smiled. "Some won't. Some will pretend not to. But when you walk in there, dressed like the royalty you come from, they'll feel it, even if they don't understand it." Imani nodded slowly, her eyes returning to the mirror. "I want to be like them," she said. "Not just with a dress. I want to know their names, their stories." Tasha stood, wrapping an arm around her daughter. Then we'll learn together. Outside, the Alabama sky was shifting from dusk to night, casting indigo streaks across the buildings. Inside, the energy had changed. The air no longer held the weight of quiet sadness. It buzzed instead with intention, with creativity, with something bold taking shape between mother and daughter. The dress would not be just a costume. It would be a message, a line drawn in gold thread, a declaration. And Imani Jackson was preparing not just to wear a crown, but to own it. The morning of career day arrived with an uncharacteristic stillness. The house, usually buzzing with the usual school morning rush, felt sacred somehow, as though both Imani and her mother knew that what was about to happen was more than just an ordinary day. Tasha woke earlier than usual, and stood for a long time over the iron, pressing each fold and pleat of the gown with the kind of precision one might reserve for preparing a sacred garment. The deep violet fabric shimmered faintly in the dim light of the living room, the golden embroidery along the hem glowing like sunlight against dusk. This was not a costume from a store. It was a piece of work, of care, of legacy stitched into fabric. And today, it would become armor. Imani stepped out of her bedroom without a word, already dressed in the base layer, a fitted top and tights that would allow the gown to drape over her without slipping. Her hair, coiled and washed the night before, had been twisted into intricate braids that spiraled like rivers, adorned with gold thread carefully woven in. At the crown of her head sat the centerpiece, a handmade circlet shape from wire and beads, delicate but unmistakably regal. Tasha knelt before her daughter and helped her into the gown. As she fastened the last clasp, she paused, her fingers lingering on Imani's shoulders. "How do you feel?" she asked. Imani glanced at herself in the mirror. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes moved over the reflection, over the layered fabric, the tall stance, the unfamiliar presence looking back at her. "I feel," she hesitated, searching for the word, "like I'm supposed to be this." Tasha smiled, brushing a loose braid behind her daughter's ear. "That's because you are." The drive to school was quiet, the usual chatter absent. Imani stared out the window, her fingers resting gently on her lap. When they reached the school parking lot, Tasha parked and turned to face her daughter, but before she could speak, Imani reached for the door. "I got it," she said softly, stepping out onto the pavement. From the moment she entered the school building, silence followed her. At first it was subtle, just a hush in the hallway, a pause in footsteps. But as more students saw her, that silence became something heavier. Whispers floated between clusters of kids, some wide-eyed, others smirking, a few confused. A girl near the lockers gasped. A boy nudged his friend and pointed. Imani walked straight ahead. Each step echoed not just through the corridor, but through the doubt she had carried since that awful moment weeks ago. She didn't shrink. She didn't look down. She walked like someone who knew where she came from, like someone who had studied not just fairy tales, but the women who ruled empires. When she entered the classroom, Mrs. Holbrook looked up from her desk, her eyes immediately widening with surprise. She stood quickly. "Well, now," she said, breathless. "Don't you look magnificent?" Imani nodded slightly. She said nothing, but she stood tall. Around her, the room was full of astronauts and chefs, police officers and scientists. Paper hats, plastic badges, face paint. But no one else wore a floor-length gown stitched with the care of generations. No one else wore a crown made by hand in history. And no one else stood as silently and proudly as Imani did. Lindsay, seated near the windows in a pink veterinarian costume, complete with a stuffed cat, turned and stared, her expression twisted between confusion and something else, something resembling discomfort. She blinked and whispered to the girl beside her, "Is she serious?" Imani met her gaze and held it. She didn't flinch. She didn't smile either. "Yes," she said, her voice calm and even. "I'm a real princess." The classroom, which had been buzzing just moments ago, fell silent. Even Mrs. Holbrook paused. Lindsay's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Finally, she looked away. Later, during the classroom presentations, each child was called up to share their outfit and explain their career choice. When it was Imani's turn, She walked to front without hesitation. Her dress trailed behind her like a banner. "I'm a princess," she said clearly, "but not like in cartoons. I'm a descendant of real queens and warriors. My name is Imani, and that means faith. Today I'm wearing a dress inspired by African royalty, like Queen Amina and Princess Elizabeth Bagaya." She paused, her eyes sweeping over the room. Her voice did not shake. They had skin like mine, hair like mine, and they didn't need saving. They were the leaders. They were smart and brave and powerful. I want to be like them, not pretend to be someone else, but become the kind of girl who remembers who she is, even when others forget. There was a moment of stillness, and then, surprisingly, applause. A few hesitant claps from the front row grew into a full round of applause. Mrs. Holbrook's eyes glistened slightly as she clapped the loudest. Even Lindsay, though she didn't applaud, sat still and quiet. After the presentations, several students came up to Imani. Some asked questions about the queens she had mentioned. One girl asked where she got her dress. A boy named Marcus, dressed as a police officer, simply said, "You looked cool," during lunch. Imani sat at her usual table, but this time a few extra chairs pulled up. No one treated her like a spectacle. They asked about her crown, about the stories in her book, and Imani answered, not with arrogance, but with quiet pride. By the time the final bell rang, she no longer felt like the girl who'd been told she couldn't be something. She felt like someone who had created space for herself in a place that had once tried to shrink her. When she got in the car after school, Tasha looked over with cautious curiosity. "Well," she asked. Imani stared straight ahead for a moment, then let a slow smile cross her face. "They saw me," she said simply, and for the first time in weeks, it didn't matter if everyone understood. What mattered was that she had walked into that room in full color, in full truth, and refused to make herself smaller. Tasha reached over and squeezed her hand, saying nothing. The dress rustled softly as Imani shifted in her seat, and though it was just fabric, it felt like something more, a symbol, perhaps, of the girl she was becoming. Not because of a costume, but because she had dared to redefine what it meant to wear a crown. The Monday following career day arrived with an air of subtle expectancy. It wasn't something spoken aloud, but rather a shift in glances, in the way students passed Imani in the hall with curiosity rather than disregard. Something had changed, not in volume or fanfare, but in the quiet weight of attention. No longer the girl who'd been told she couldn't be something. Now, Imani had become someone others noticed, someone who had said something bold and had not been silenced by laughter. Mrs. Holbrook began the morning routine as always, but when she paused to take attendance, her eyes briefly met Imani's and held there for a second longer than usual. A silent affirmation passed between them. Then, just as the students settled in, a knock came at the classroom door. The school secretary stepped in and handed a note to the teacher, who read it quickly, nodded, and looked toward Imani. "The principal would like to speak with you. Imani." The class let out a collective murmur, and as Imani stood up and made her way to the door, the curiosity around her swelled. But she kept her head high. The hallway stretched before her, familiar and unchanged, but her footsteps carried a different weight now, one of presence, not invisibility. Mr. Reynolds, the principal, was already standing when she arrived. His office, usually stiff and sterile, felt less intimidating today. He motioned for her to sit, then eased back into his own chair, folding his hands on the desk. "Imani," he began, his tone neutral but his eyes thoughtful. "I want to talk to you about Friday." She sat quietly, unsure where this was going. "You made quite an impression." Still no reaction. Imani had been taught not to assume praise until it was clearly offered. He went on, "After your presentation, several teachers reached out to me. They said you spoke with poise, with thoughtfulness. But more than that, they were moved by what you shared about representation, about identity. One of our social studies teachers mentioned your reference to historical African royalty. She said it opened her eyes to a gap in our curriculum." Imani blinked, unsure how to respond. Mr. Reynolds leaned forward. "We've been reevaluating the content we teach, especially around history and culture. We want to make space for stories like the ones you told. And not just in one-off events like Career Day. I've spoken with the staff, and we're going to start building a new unit next semester, one that includes African kingdoms, real historical queens and leaders alongside the typical material. We think our students deserve to know more than just one version of the world. Imani's breath caught slightly. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't even hoped for it. All she'd wanted was to wear her dress, to speak her truth aloud. She'd never imagined it would ripple this far. We'd like to invite you and your mother to help us with this, he continued. If you're willing, maybe share the book you brought to class, the names you mentioned. You could even come speak to some of the younger grades. For a long moment, Imani said nothing. Then she nodded slowly. Yes, she said, voice steady. I'd like that. When she returned to class, a few students turned in their seats, eyebrows raised, waiting for some clue as to what had happened. She didn't offer one, but during lunch, a group of younger students approached her in the cafeteria. One girl, maybe 7, with dark brown skin and barrettes in her hair, stood with her tray clutched in both hands. Are you the princess from Friday? Imani paused, then smiled gently. I'm not a princess in a movie, but I wore a dress that said I could be, and that's what I believe now. The girl nodded solemnly, then shuffled back to her table. Imani watched her go, something new blooming in her chest. A quiet pride that had nothing to do with applause or attention. It had to do with reflection, with seeing herself mirrored in another child's eyes. By the end of the week, change had begun to take shape beyond whispers. Mrs. Holbrook started adding brief profiles of women from African history into the morning routine. Names like Hatshepsut, Nzinga, and Nefertiti were introduced with short bios and pictures pinned to the whiteboard. Students were invited to write responses, draw portraits, and even suggest figures to include. One morning, Marcus, a boy who'd never spoken much, stood in front of the class and talked about Hannibal of Carthage. He crossed the Alps with elephants, he said proudly, and a few students gasped. And he wasn't white. He was African. The class clapped. Imani sat in the back that day, listening, a soft smile on her lips. But the changes weren't limited to just classroom content. The school walls, once decorated with predictable images of American presidents and scientists, began to shift. A new mural went up near the cafeteria, a series of painted portraits of global historical leaders, with space left for more to be added throughout the year. Imani's mother, invited to help oversee the design, had tears in her eyes when she saw the early sketches. One afternoon, while Imani was helping clean up after art class, Mrs. Holbrook approached her. You know, the teacher said, sometimes we spend years waiting for change to come from above, but it rarely does. What you did, it sparked something. You reminded us that schools should be places where all kids see themselves in the stories we tell. Imani looked up from the brushes. She was rinsing. I just wore a dress, she said quietly. Mrs. Holbrook shook her head. No, sweetheart, you wore your history. That night at home, Imani sat cross-legged on the floor again, sketchbook open in her lap. But the drawings were different now. The princesses she drew had deep brown skin, braid and curls, wide noses, and full lips. Some wore armor, others robes. All of them looked like someone she might meet in her mirror. She turned to her mother, who was folding laundry nearby. Can we find more stories? She asked. Not just queens. Maybe poets, scientists, women who built things. Tasha smiled. We'll find as many as you want. Imani nodded and began sketching again, lines forming purposefully beneath her pencil. She no longer drew to escape. Now, she drew to remember, to imagine, to build. The change had started with a single stitch gown, but the transformation was not in the fabric. It was in the girl who wore it, and in the school that finally began to reflect the world through her eyes. As summer approached and the Alabama heat stretched into the late afternoons, the buzz around Imani Jackson had begun to settle. Not because people forgot what she had done, but because it had slowly become part of the fabric of the school itself. What had started as a moment of courage was now a presence, a quiet shift. Her story was no longer whispered in passing. It had embedded itself into the rhythm of the school's life, into bulletin boards, lesson plans, hallway conversations. But more importantly, It had taken root in Imani herself. One humid Saturday, Tasha received an unexpected call from the director of the city's community arts center, a woman named Mrs. Claiborne, who had heard about Imani's career day presentation through her niece, a teacher at the school. She explained that the center will be hosting its annual Heritage Voices celebration, a showcase of cultural expression from local youth, and asked if Imani might be interested in presenting something. Tasha passed the phone to her daughter, who listened intently, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her shirt. When the conversation ended, she sat silently for a few moments, eyes focused on nothing in particular. "You don't have to say yes," Tasha said gently, sensing her daughter's hesitation. "You've already done so much." Imani looked up. "She said I could talk about a princess. A real one, but not just say the name. Tell her story, like a performance." Tasha nodded. "Do you want to?" There was a pause, then a quiet, firm answer. "I think I do." Over the next several weeks, Imani worked on her presentation with the kind of focus that made the hours pass without notice. She chose Queen Amina of Zaza, the warrior monarch who had expanded her territory and ruled with strength and strategy centuries before any fairy tales had been written in Europe. The story resonated with her. Amina had been told what she could not do, and she did it anyway, not in defiance, but in destiny. With Tasha's help, Imani practiced in their living room each evening. She didn't just read from cards. She learned to speak with rhythm, to hold silence before delivering a line, to make her words feel like memory instead of performance. Tasha coached her gently, never correcting too much, always reminding her that her power came not from perfection, but from conviction. When the day of the event arrived, the community center was packed. Rows of folding chairs lined the large room, filled with families, teachers, and neighbors. The stage itself was modest, just a raised platform with a simple backdrop, but to Imani, it felt larger than any room she'd entered before. Backstage, her hands trembled slightly as she waited. Her outfit was simpler this time. Not the full princess gown, but a knee-length tunic of vibrant red with golden trim, paired with sandals and a sash tied at the waist. Her braids were adorned again with golden threads, and a single pendant hung from her neck, a gift from Tasha, shaped like a crown, small enough to rest just above her heart. As her name was called, the room quieted. She stepped onto the stage, her legs steady despite the flutter in her chest. She looked out at the audience, at the unfamiliar faces, the scattering of people she knew, her mother in the third row, eyes steady and calm. She began to speak. She told them about Amina's early life, about how she was trained as a warrior while others expected her to marry. She described the battles, the cities built under her reign, the fear she inspired in her enemies. But Imani didn't just tell Amina's story. She embodied it. Her voice rose and fell with purpose. Her eyes scanned the crowd with certainty. And when she finished, she paused for a moment, letting the weight of silence hang in the air before she spoke her final words. She was not a princess waiting to be chosen. She was a queen who chose herself. The room erupted into applause. It wasn't the loudness that struck Imani, but the way it lingered. People stood. A few cheered. Her mother clapped with quiet tears on her cheeks. And as Imani stepped down from the stage, she felt something shift not outside but within. Later, as the event wrapped up and families lingered, a little girl approached. She was maybe 6, with a round face and 2 puffed ponytails bouncing as she walked. She stopped in front of Imani, clutching a program folded in half. "I liked your story," she said shyly. "I didn't know there were real princesses like that." Imani crouched so their eyes were level. "There are," she said warmly, "and you can be one too." The girl frowned slightly. "But I don't have a crown." Imani smiled, reaching out to gently touch the girl's shoulder. "You don't need one. You already have everything inside you. Just remember who you are." The girl grinned and ran back to her mother. Imani stood slowly, watching her go. She didn't feel like a performer anymore. She didn't even feel like a student telling a story. She felt something deeper, something rooted, like she had finally stepped fully into the space she had only been peeking into before. That night, back at home, she sat on her bed, the pendant still hanging around her neck. Tasha entered with a mug of tea, and sat beside her. "You were incredible today," she said. Imani nodded. "I felt like I wasn't pretending." Tasha looked at her daughter with soft pride. "You weren't. You were speaking from a place some people never find. That place where your voice isn't trying to sound like anyone else's. It's just yours." There was a long pause. Then Imani leaned her head against her mother's shoulder. "Do you think people really change? Like for good?" Tasha thought for a moment. "I think people who remember who they are don't just change themselves. They change the world around them. Bit by bit." Imani closed her eyes. "I'm going to keep telling stories." Tasha smiled. "You already are." As the house fell into its usual nighttime hush, Imani placed her sketchbook on the nightstand. The page she had left open showed a new drawing, not of a princess in a distant castle, but of a young girl standing on a stage, one hand raised, eyes bright, a crown not on her head, but drawn in the air above her. Light, unseen, but there. She turned off the lamp and whispered to the dark, not because she was unsure, but because the words were too big to be said aloud. "I remember now." And she did.